I will make a start, everybody. I'd like to introduce Melody Dane, now Associate Professor as of January 1st, so congratulations on your recent promotion. So originally from China, Melody completed her PhD in California at UC San Diego. Yep. And she's now at the Prevention Research Collaboration at the University of Sydney. I'm going to embarrass her for a second here. So amongst her many honors, she was the 2018 New South Wales Young Tall Poppy of the Year from the Australian Institute of Policy and Science, which is quite an achievement. And she also not only published an article on physical activity in The Lancet, but led an entire series of articles in the 2016 edition on physical activity in The Lancet, which is excellent. She has quite varied research interests, I think it would be fair to say. Everything from screen time to yoga to nutrition to tobacco to car dependency and my favorite, which is dog walking. So I suspect that the Random Thoughts and Research experience is an excellent way to present such varied interests, and we're certainly happy that you could come and look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was pretty much the best introductions I've ever had. Seriously, because people always ask me, what is your research niche? And I always have to apologize and say that my research niche is not having a niche. So, because I've got so many interests, I see everything as being connected, and that's why I use this buzzword now you see in fine dining restaurant menu, curated samplers or cheese or whatever, so because it's lunchtime, so I thought I'd just borrow that word there, and as you can tell, it's going to be about many things. But I think the good thing is, if I present many things, there will probably be higher probability of one of you guys being interested in some of the things I present. Well, Chris has already introduced a little bit. Just very quickly going through my journey. I was born in this city in northwestern China. It's literally, according to Guinness World Record, the most inland city of the world. So it has the longest distance to any coast. That's why I was aspired to study marine biology for my undergrads. So, in Ocean University of China, because I just wanted to see something I've never seen at that point. And I got a bit bored and thought that was not a good match for me. So the reason is because I had this imagination, like many of us who joined marine biology, that is what marine biology was about. But then it's really like this, and I thought that, I need a change. I want something that is a bit bigger picture thinking, less lab work, and I found my passion in public health going across the Pacific, joined San Diego State University for my Master's of Public Health, and followed by my PhD in Public Health from UCSD. And I was very fortunate to live in such a beautiful city for more than 6 years and work with two of the world's gurus in behavioral science and physical activity. So Mel Hubble and Tim Salas. And after that, I came to Australia for my so far first and only job after my PhD. And a lot of my research kind of lies in the intersection between environments, behaviors, and health outcomes. So today I'm going to give you a few examples. Some might be intersecting this way, others might be intersecting this way, and some might be just bringing all these together. So that's my icebreaker, so I hope that now you can all relax and feel free to interact, ask questions, shout at me anytime needed, and this is a brief overview of the talk today. It's not too complicated, and I really, appreciate any sort of interactions, questions at any point. So I don't want us to be talking at you guys, but rather talking with each other. Feel free to throw tomatoes at me. Alright, so part one, talking about why I think it's important to look at health behaviors as a whole, rather than looking at them in isolation. So this is something I really personally experience, people ask me who I am, going back to the niche of not having a niche thing again. I think this is the trend, and part of that is because this is how disciplines have evolved in modern science. We start to go narrow and more narrow, and we become physical activity expert, we become physical activity in children expert, we become physical activity in children with psychological disorder expert. So there's a lot of benefits in having more in-depth knowledge, but I think there's also a lot of benefit in zooming out and having a look at how these behaviors are interrelated. So this is like a good dialogue in terms of public health, because oftentimes we focus a lot on the outcome. So the endpoint could be heart disease, could be diabetes, or it could be death, and before that we have surrogate outcomes. But if we go down to the roots, behaviors are driving the majority of our disease burden. And behaviors are often manifested within the causes of causes, the environment, the air we breathe in, the politics, the policies, the transportation, everything, you name it. And all of these are interrelated. So when we go back to looking at behaviors as a whole, within the context of the causes of causes, everything seems to be interlinked. And then another way to look at it is in a health as a tree model. This is from WHO, and a very clinical approach would be basically looking at the manifested diseases. But when it goes back to the behavioral causes, many of these behaviors cause multiple diseases at the same time. Some behaviors interact with each other when in the causation of diseases, and I think it's actually important that we put the soil here as well, which is the causes of causes that I mentioned earlier. If we don't have that approach, especially if you're given a large data set, some kind of epidemiological data set, so that's always something I advocate against, without having the proper big picture ideas about what's the research context, what's the current knowledge, what's the relevance in doing something. It's very easy for us to make this mistake that we just randomly pick an exposure that is randomly associated with an outcome in random populations, and that gets your publications. Unfortunately, that's how it goes these days with how research is being evaluated. There's change happening, but I think it's actually much harder to bring everything together rather than just like, I'm writing one paper on drinking coffee and heart disease among women. So I'm also using this opportunity to advocate for better practice in science, to avoid doing these kind of research for sake of research, just to get your publications. So my first argument for looking at behaviors together is that sometimes behaviors interact, and I briefly mentioned that before. So my research on this topic, this is an example from the 45 and up study. So this is the largest cohort study in the Southern Hemisphere here in New South Wales. So very impressive number is that 10% of the target population, 45 and up, so those who are aged 45 and up in New South Wales, about 10% of them were samples of the study. And so what I was looking at is, if we look at the typical risk behaviors, physical activity, alcohol, diet, smoking, and adding emerging risk factors, sleeping, unhealthy sleep durations, and sitting, how those behaviors interact with each other in terms of relationship to all-cause mortality. So this is a very interesting example demonstrating the synergistic relationship. So if we look at alcohol alone, so these are the people, so 4% of the sample, they're the one who pretty much are doing well with all the other risk factors. And the only thing they're not doing well is that they drink more than 14 serves of alcohol every week. So if they're in that group, the hazard ratio for all-cause mortality is actually, as you can see here, very close to 1, and it's not significant. And if we look at smoking, so not drinking alcohol excessively, doing everything else well but smoker, and then we're looking at 1.9, so it's about double the risk as compared with those who didn't have any risk factors. Short sleep durations, for example, this is a borderline, pretty much close to 1. But when we start to look at people having multiple risk factors together, that's when the interesting patterns start to emerge. So if we're looking at those who are who are at risk for alcohol and smoking combined, we start to see synergistic relationship, and smoking and short sleep. Again, remember that short sleep is barely larger than 1, but if you look at those possessing 2 risk factors, we're looking at almost tripling the risk, and looking at those with 3 risk factors altogether. It's a very synergistic relationship. And very similar effect that we observe in activity-related behavior. So for those who are sitting more than 7 hours a day and doing well in all the other things, probably a lot of us belong to these categories. We have a desk-based job, but we're very health conscious otherwise. So again, hazard ratio is 1.15, so that's not too elevated, the risk. And physical inactivity alone is 1.6, but when you combine that together, for people who are sitting a lot and not being physically active, then we're starting to see a much bigger risk. And again, with long sleep, we see synergistic relationship, and for people possessing all these risk factors, it's a hazard ratio of 4.
Tell me, are these additive or are there interactions between them?
Multiplicative.
Pardon?
Multiplicative. So yeah, as you can tell, it's larger than these 2 adding together. Thank you. Good question.
Because you've got pluses there.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
No.
it's basically just being 2 at the same time. So this gave us an idea about, look, when we're just adjusting for another risk factors in a model, we're holding that value at the mean level. We're not getting into the intricate connections and interactions across risk factors, and this gave us also very interesting ideas in terms of profiling the population for a risk of multiple risk factors, and we start to look at the fundamental differences to people who are within different clusters of risk factors. So currently I'm working on extending this research by using latent profile analysis and looking at how the clusters of risk factors evolve over time. So in 2 years' time or 1 year, I will give an update here if you're interested. So similarly, we conduct similar studies among the Hunt cohort in Norway, so we find similar things. Sedentary behavior and inactivity seems to have a synergistic relationship together, and that was before the 2016 Lancet paper on sedentary behavior, the paper that's a harmonized meta-analysis looking at basically if you're physically active enough, you might actually undo some of the harm that is associated with prolonged sitting, but if you're physically inactive and sitting a lot, that's a very deadly combination. So this is kind of my research report that came out, and I was very glad that this kind of finding was validated by that strong research papers. So yeah, in this paper we also look at low social participation as one of the risk factors, which I think is actually quite understudied and we should understand more. Currently I have a PhD student who's very interested in low social participation and social isolation. And yeah, maybe we can come give some presentation in a few years' time. So this is just another applications of the behavioral risk score we developed for hypertension outcomes, and again we're seeing not only additive nature in terms of risk factors, but among men and women we started to see interesting behavioral patterns in terms of cluster of lifestyle risk factors being particularly harmful for hypertension. So the second reason why I think behaviors, we should look at behaviors as a whole, is because sometimes our behaviors are bounded by time or other kind of limited resources. I think time is a good example here, and this is particularly relevant to the research interest here because when we think about how we expend our energy, how we spend our time, physical activity, sleep, sitting, and standing and all that, we only have 24 hours in a day, and it doesn't matter how much money you have, you can't buy the 24th hour. So that's why it's important when we're modeling physical activity or sedentary behavior, we take into account of the limited nature of time. So this is one of our early papers on isotemporal substitution. It's an alternative modeling technique to the typical, we call it partition models. So when we think about typical regression models, whether that's survival analysis or logistic regression, the assumption is when we interpret our beta coefficient or our hazard ratios, that risk is associated as when you increase your physical activity by this amount, you're observing this much increase or decrease risk in whatever outcome. But the reality is we cannot hypothetically increase another hours of physical activity and another hours without reducing some activities in terms of time. So in nature, we cannot just ask people to do 30 minutes a day more. We're actually asking them to replace 30 minutes of other things with physical activity. So this modeling technique took care of that, and this is based on our modeling. It looks like when we're looking at replacing sedentary time, we're pretty much seeing decrease in all-cause mortality when we replace sedentary time with anything, really. So even standing has small but significant effect, and when we replace sedentary time with walking and moderate vigorous physical activity, we seem to see the biggest risk reduction. So that was in 2015, and then we just updated this research with longer follow-up and with cardiovascular disease outcome and cardiovascular disease mortality. Similar technique, similar finding, and the paper is probably coming out next week in Journal of American Cardiology. Wait, how does it? Journal of American Cardiology.
College of Cardiology.
Sorry, it's a really good journal, but I'm blanking on the name. So there will be press release, so you might hear about this. This updated research. So similar effect, we're looking at the effects of replacing sitting with other behaviors. In the meantime, isotemporal substitution is becoming a bit dated now, and the more up-to-date and some people claim it to be better technique is compositional analysis. So we're currently, our group, hosting a PhD student from Denmark who is an expert on compositional analysis. Just had a workshop with her last week, and it's quite intensive modeling work that you need to do in R. So, but that again, it's even possibly a stronger methodology when it comes to looking at the composition of our time rather than, say, just replacing one with the other. So that comes into the percentage of your time spent on various activity that adds up to be 24 hours or 18 hours or something. So it's I'm not an expert yet. I'm still wrapping my head around it. It's quite complicated. If you work intensively in this area.
Well, I was going to say, Borja is doing quite a bit of work in this area. I think actually that model that I was showing you running downstairs, is that compositional, that one?
That was a cross-lack model.
Oh, cross-lack.
But yeah, the best.
So you guys are like...
It's the state of the art at the moment, but I still find it quite challenging to interpret. I think when it comes to interpreting that to the general audience outside of academia, that's the challenging part with compositional data analysis.
Well, the tricky part is actually interpreting the beta value, which is not beta value anymore at some point.
Yes, yes.
It's a number there, so you can interpret this, the magnitude and the direction, that's all. Yeah. And then you have to reverse.
Exactly, yeah.
To being able to interpret
yes. So for me to see the regression coefficient not being able to be interpreted the same way, I'm still trying to understand that language. But my point of view on that, so because there's almost like two camps now. You're either like, some people just think that's the best way to go, all physical activity data should be modeled in a compositional way, and others are, less keen on doing so. I think to me the traditional approach and compositional data analysis, they both have their benefits and they're both still important, and I'm not the type of person who thinks it has to be one way or the other. I'm very open to new approaches, and I think it's always interesting when we try to answer the same research question with a different approach and coming up with similar or different results.
Well, so may I say something? So the problem with the traditional one is actually that you violate the assumption that you only have 24 hours.
Yeah.
So that's the main problem.
Yeah.
So you have to, if you want to respect that assumption, you have to go so far with composition.
Exactly. Yeah. But I'm just saying that we cannot say that our previous evidence will be physiologically acting.
Indeed, very similar actually.
Yeah.
Am I interpreting this correctly, that replacing sedentariness with sleeping less than 7 hours is beneficial?
Yes, because for the isotonic substitution, there are certain assumptions about the distribution as well, and sleep is a variable that varies the distribution, so we have to split participants into two scenarios. One is if they sleep more than 7 hours a day, and the other one's for them sleep less than 7 hours a day. So this is for people who sleep less than 7 hours a day, which we consider people who have inadequate sleep. So when they are not sleeping enough, it's beneficial for them to replace sitting with sleep. But when they're sleeping more than 7 hours a week, it's a different story, because we actually know that prolonged sleep, usually sleep over 9 hours a day, it's associated with health and disease and mortality as well. Alright, so the third point, I think it's, when we think about lifestyle behaviors, it's often related to a circumstance or circumstances. So, that's why when we're trying to classify population or subpopulation who are at risk for sedentary behavior, for physical activity, for smoking, for alcohol, what often happens is that we often end up finding the same kind of usual suspects, people having similar kind of demographic profiles or life circumstances. So that's a good opportunity for us to think about the causes of the causes. Is it really the most efficient way of using resources if we focus on smoking and smoking only among this group, and then another campaign focus on alcohol and alcohol only within this group, or step back and think about what actually is going on in their life at the moment. So this is probably not the best example, but I just think it's an interesting way of linking these behaviors together to their circumstances. This is also from a subsample of 45 now, and I was cross-sectional at that time, and we're only starting to get some longitudinal linkage data right now, so hopefully I can replicate this data now with longitudinal analysis. So we're looking at driving, something that is very close to many of our heart, and to me, driving is not only just a transport behavior, and it's actually a good indicator of your life circumstances in terms of where you live and your stress level, how you get from A to B, and what sort of life you're living in that moment. I'm just curious, how many of you guys drove here this morning? How many of you guys here drove to work this morning?
The parking is awful.
Yeah, because you guys live in such a dense urban center and right next to the train station. So when I was presenting this work in Cumberland, that was a completely different story. So that again, that is actually a good indicator, because driving is embedded in our built environment. So that is oftentimes I see that as not only the actual behavior of sitting in the car, but also a whole lot of things about where you live and what's your circumstances. So in this paper, we found that, well, even when we adjusted for everything at individual and area level, what we found was a dose-response relationship between prolonged driving and being a regular smoker, and prolonged driving and physical inactivity. So there's, unfortunately, we didn't, because the survey was not set up for this, we didn't have a lot of time a lot of information to think about why is it that we're seeing what we're seeing. But I think an easy one we can think about in terms of smoking could be, currently the legislation about about smoking in vehicles only refer to public transport. So for people who are who actually need that the smoking stimulant on the way to work, they have no other choice but to actually smoke in their car, and then that private space might prompt a sense of urge to smoke, and it could be because a long drive early in the day or in the late afternoon, they need to pick me up, and it could also be still residual confounding socioeconomically that all our adjusted variables couldn't account for. So in the case about physical inactivity, we can make similar assumptions, or it could also be due to time again, because if you spend so much time driving, you have less time for other constructive activities, including sleep as well. So we're keep on seeing the same patterns over and over again. And again, we're seeing this cluster of risk behavior among those who drive a lot. Psychological distress, that seems to be only significant if you drive more than 2 days a week, which is a lot, but actually in Sydney, that's a decent proportion of the population because it's such a spread out city with horrible traffic. Self-rated health, I'm just going through this very quickly. And one of the hypotheses we formed during that study was that why is it that driving seems to be associated with everything? And because driving is usually the only time in our public health field that it was looked at. It's usually within the context of sedentary behaviors. So with Larry Frank's groundbreaking work in 2009, linking obesity and driving together for the first time. You guys probably seen this beautiful infographics about a belt. With every hour you drive, you need an extra hole for it. So that was from that time was the first evidence in public health about linking driving to something. But since then, people generally consider driving as low energy expenditure, sedentary behavior. But I was thinking that driving could be more than just sedentary behavior. There might be other aspects of driving that is bad. So one thing I can think about in terms of the difference between driving and sitting and watch TV, for example, is the stress. It's the constant reaction of reacting to traffic, pedestrians, other aggressive drivers, situations on the road. So we designed this physiological study thanks to the open, planned, and multidisciplinary design of the CPC. I met a physiologist from the Faculty of Health Sciences, so we designed this study together to recruit participants, send them off at 3 p.m. every day. It's controlled, and it's controlled with the individuals. To drive on Parramatta Road or westbound towards Ashfield Bunnings, give them a task to buy certain things in Bunnings. So try to really imitate a real world situation of like running an errand, going somewhere, drive back. And then we have multiple measures, including heart rate variability, including cortisol, including heart rate, blood pressure, many things. We monitor them throughout and then come back pre-post. As compared with watching David Attenborough sitting somewhere, documentary, as compared with the third condition, we expose people to 25 to 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity before sending them off to drive, and then come back. So it's a very interesting study, quite difficult to recruit people, but eventually we got enough people to do all three conditions, and they serve as controls, a random crossover design, so they're controls within themselves. And what we found was the conclusion here. So driving induces stress response, no surprise, and exercise, but driving is considered a moderate. It's like light moderate stressor. It's not quite as bad as, say, public speaking for some people, but if we're chronically exposed to a moderate stressor, it's still not a good thing. And then the other interesting finding is that exercise intervention seems to be dampening our stress response to driving. So, that has a lot of implications. For example, how about we encourage people to park far away when they have to drive, so that they do some brisk walking for 15 minutes before they start driving and after. So maybe that makes driving less stressful. So this is a pilot study, and then we're working on collaborating with a group in Edinburgh to make this study more public health based, because this is still at the lab level. And the fourth argument that I have here about looking at multiple behaviors, it's about circumstances, but it's also about the change in circumstances. When we think about our life, going through stages, changes happen, and sometimes as a result of going through changes, our behaviors change and our health outcomes change as a result. So, currently it's very trendy to probably see it everywhere, the whole lifespan model, how everything that we've been doing since preconception to later in life, they all contribute to our health cumulatively. And I'm particularly interested in that transitioning phase when major events happen in life that prompt you to change your behavior in certain ways. So this is an old paper from again, a subsample of the 45-month study, and I'm interested in what effect retirement have on people. At that time, my mom was going through retirement, and that's why I thought that I was interested in researching this, because there has been some research on physical activity. I think that's the most well-researched behavior in the context of retirement. That is, general finding is that we see more increase in leisure time physical activity after retirement, but decrease in transport and occupational, as you can imagine. So when we're looking at overall physical activity, the pattern is actually less clear. So what I did was to take a step further to look at the whole range of lifestyle behaviors and see if people become healthier as a result of retirement. And that was a study as well that generated a lot of interest in the media, and I recently was doing an article in UniSuper because superannuation was interested in any articles related to retirement. So some of you might have seen my article and the cover model photo from UniSuper magazine, but that's how I consider this as real-world research translation, because the insurance companies and super fund, they're particularly interested in this topic. And I'm still getting interview requests 3 years later. So just briefly on the findings, I will skip the methodological details. So we're looking at employment status at 2 time points with about 3 years in between. So then we divided the population, the sample, into 2 groups. One group, the reference group, is the ones who stayed in the workforce, and the comparison groups are the ones who switch from working to retirement. So what we found was that as compared with those who are still working, we see a reduction in odds of smoking among retirement, and it's particularly strong in women. So for women smokers after retirement, they're more likely to keep a habit, and we see significant changes in physical. So this is the reverse, physical inactivity, reduction in physical inactivity. So people become more active. People are more likely to sleep at healthy durations and less likely to sit for long. So particularly, when we summarize all this into a lifestyle index, comparing with those who stay in the workplace, we see a reduction in overall lifestyle index risk score among those who retired. So overall, we're seeing a positive picture about retirement. And particularly when we break down the physical activity to see where do we see the increase the most. So here, among those who retired after 3 years, during 3 years of follow-up, we see 99 minutes increase per week in physical activity as compared with 36 among those who didn't retire. And the majority of the increase come from moderate intensity physical activity. So this is an Active Australia questionnaire. So these are the ones that referring to, social tennis, swimming, gentle swimming, I call it, or even just working in the yard. So mostly in leisure time, but not quite vigorous, because for this age group and in the sample, there's hardly any vigorous activity happening. But yeah, we're seeing very good changes in respect to physical activity. And the next question is whether the benefit of retirement has been reaped equally by people of different social circumstances and socioeconomic status. And what we found was particularly those with university education, which in this group are the high socioeconomic status category, this seems to improve the most in most of the variables we examined, particularly physical activity. Another effect modifier we examined, and I don't have here as a slide, is the reason of retirement, because we know that people retire for different reasons. Some are planned and purely by choice, and others might be due to sickness, due to responsibility to look after others. So we're seeing a very interesting pattern that when a retirement is volitional, so when it's planned and it's for leisure and it's by choice, we see very positive changes in lifestyle behaviors as compared with those who sort of had no choice. They were laid off, they had to look after sick loved ones or retired due to sickness. We're seeing either no change or sometimes even worsening outcomes. So I guess my message here is, you know, retirement could be a good thing, and if you can plan for it, plan for it.
Question?
Yes.
With retirement, did you check on the mortality rate between those who stayed in the workforce and those who retired?
That's a very interesting question. At that time of the study, the follow-up data has not been linked to the administrative health outcomes. But again, like what I just mentioned, now I've got more updated data coming out, especially with linkage. That could be something to examine.
Because I have a friend whose uncle retired, living a great life, 1 year into retirement, perfect health, and just dropped dead.
I don't know.
Stay at work, Rich.
I could drop that here.
Don't do that either.
So you're towards a happy transition now. I don't know if that's causal, and I think that's probably more of an individual case as compared with something we can generalize to the population. But interesting thought, and I think it's worth examining. Thanks for sharing. Now we're going to move on to my part 2, which I promise will involve less talking than part 1. So that is going back to the earlier diagram. I'm now trying to link environment to behavior, which is actually my original trait, because working with Jim Salas, he was a guru of built environment and physical activity. A lot of my earlier works are from this area. And I don't have to remind you how things are different these days, and we're becoming more and more, our environment around us have become, you know, more and more facilitating sedentary behavior, conserve our energy expenditure as compared with decades and centuries ago. And based on socio-ecological model, our behaviors are a product of a range of multi-layers of influences with environment, especially the built environment, playing an important role. Here's somebody walking. I'm going to skip that. So, actually I'm not going to skip that. Just very quickly, some basic concepts. So, this is the typical demonstration of how neighborhoods could be built. So, separated by a main road here, the north side, let's call it the North Park, and this is the South Park. So, as we can tell immediately that there are some major differences in the layout of these two cities, two neighborhoods. Which one do you think is more activity friendly?
South Park.
South Park, yes. So there's a couple of key differences that we see here. One thing is the street connectivity seems to be quite different. This is the typical grid pattern, and that's the traditional street layout because they were invented before cars were invented. But now planners are going back to it now because it's more activity friendly, it's actually more efficient, better at reducing traffic, and so it's called neo-traditional now because, you know, now we figure out that our ancestors got it right, and this is a typical sprawl like you see a lot in North America and Western Sydney. And another difference is that here you see that the shopping mall is set aside to the edge of the city. This is a very classical kind of American suburban design as compared with in South Park, all the other destinations and schools and shopping malls, they are embedded within the community. So this is a concept that planners call land use mix. So when you think about a place like Newtown, you can basically, you know, if you live in Newtown, you can pretty much, or even here, you can just walk to whatever destination if you need food, if you need to post a letter, if you need to go to the bank, if you need to buy clothes. All these different land use patterns are all in the same area with residential land use. So it is a feature that we consider that it's activity friendly, and it's actually an important indicator within the concept of walkability. So that's all I'm going to say about this. So if we look at built environment and physical activity research, the inception is around the turn of the century, almost 20 years ago now. The growth in the number of papers in terms of evidence building is exponential. So if I put 2009 here, it will be off the chart. So people are continuing. I mean, it's a positive thing that we start to realize more and more that environment plays such an important role to our physical activity as compared with, pre-21st century. People are mainly interested in interpersonal and interpersonal risk factors. But the problem is, still in 2019, most of the research in this field are still cross-sectional studies, and very conservative estimate based on my search for between 2016 and 2019, so it's the more up-to-date time, about 4% of all the papers published in the field are longitudinal. So, yeah, and the early ones are only cross-sectional. So altogether, we'll probably get 2% longitudinal study. Yeah, so 98% about cross-sectional. So that raises a very important question. So when it comes to neighborhood design and selection, there is a very important concept called self-selection. So if actually, this is a good example. I'm about to move at the moment, so I'm in the process of relocation myself, and I want to choose a suburb that is close to the beach because I like ocean-based activity. I want an environment that facilitates my lifestyle and facilitates my physical activity lifestyle, particularly. So I'm already active before I move to a very activity-friendly neighborhood, and vice versa. Especially when it comes to an expensive city like Sydney, oftentimes, unfortunately, it's not about where you want to live, but where you can afford to live. So there's so much happening before you even move somewhere, and then to make conclusions, draw conclusions about these kind of environments promote physical activity might be a bit premature, and we might be going through the chicken or egg issue. So what are the other best options? So environmental interventions, a good one. The Bridge in Cambridge does a lot of work on that. So when something happened to your neighborhood, it's the same people living in the neighborhood, but when the light rail is built, when there's a park being renovated, when there's a new swimming pool, we see how people react to the changes. It's challenging because you cannot time your funding applications to the actual progress on the field. And David Ogilvy's group can give a whole lot of stories about this. It rarely goes well, and unfortunately, as important as it is, it's just very difficult to maneuver. Longitudinal studies, much better than cross-sectional. Still, we have to deal with the self-selection issues, but it's a step closer towards causality. And what I'm particularly interested in is relocation studies. So same people, relocated, and at different time point, comparing their behavior changes, hopefully as a result of relocation. There's still self-selection going on, but we're just building incremental, better evidence out there. So this is my grant from the Heart Foundation using the 45 and up study as the base to look at those who relocated over time to see how their physical activity and other lifestyle behavior changes as a result of relocating neighborhoods. So this is a study in progress. This is still the initial conceptual diagrams, and again, it's a work in progress, and I'm hoping to update you guys once we have exciting outcomes. So the basic idea is that we compare movers with stayers, and we compare those move within the moving group based on the type of neighborhoods they move to. So they could be either moving to more walkable neighborhood, less walkable neighborhood, or similar neighborhoods, and we see how their behaviors change as a result of that. And the positive news is, because we have such a large sample, there's quite a bit of people moved during the follow-up time. So now between the first time point and the follow-up is about 5 years, so we actually have thousands of people who relocated. So this kind of study, you can only afford to do it when you have a large enough sample to start with, because moving is something we do a few times in life only. And then while we're trying to go through the logistic issue with the studies, we examined the literature to see how much work has been done on relocation, and as compared with cross-sectional studies that you've seen, thousands, tens of thousands of them, we only found else? Remind me how many?
I think we had
26?
26, 7
Yeah.
papers, and
But
some of those were
retrospective.
No, some of them
From the same study. Yeah, so we found 26 papers only. Effects of relocation on physical activity, walking, or active travel lifestyle. So it's a fraction as compared with the easier, more convenient cross-sectional studies. And there are from less than 20 studies altogether, and half of them are retrospective, so the evidence is still quite low. But through this paper, we're advocating for higher level evidence building, not repeating what we're doing for so many years, and instead of looking for innovative research design, opportunities that might give us better evidence. As the 2012 Lancet series quoted, more of the same is not enough. So I hope that with built environment and physical activity research, we could start to do something that is not more or less the same. So this is the infographics we developed as a result of that systematic reviews, and if you guys are interested in the systematic reviews, we also not only summarize the current result, but also give suggestions for future studies to improve the current evidence based on cross-sectional studies. So we're invited to develop infographics that was just accepted this morning when I woke up. So that will be out for you guys to be the first one to see what this looks like. So we're highlighting the concept of relocations and how features in the new neighborhoods could promote an active lifestyle. My final example of natural experiment is related to changing environment again. And I think Australia is just such a perfect environment to study this, because in Sydney, for example, we have more than 40% of the residents in Sydney being born outside of Australia. And I think nothing changes the environment more than relocating country. And I can speak about that myself because I relocated twice. And each time my behavior changes as a result of the country I moved to. And particularly within Australia, UK and New Zealand are the main origin countries where migrants come from. And China ranks just behind New Zealand, so that's the largest country of origin that English is not the first language. And because of my background, I'm particularly interested in the Chinese population. We've got about 2% of Australians now being born in China, and about 4% of them claiming Chinese heritage. So I think that's a very interesting group that we should study. And this is a subsample of Chinese participants in 45 and up. We've got more than 4,000 participants who were born in China. So we're looking at how acculturation influence their lifestyle behaviors. And acculturation is basically this concept that once you move to a new country, you start to behave more like the host country. So for Chinese to start to behave more like Aussies, that's a process of acculturation. So they're different. It's in a psychology term, I think acculturation is more or less a latent variable because you can't really measure it. So the best indicators we measured are time you spend in the host country and language you speak at home. And particularly what I like is about age at migration. So we usually consider those who immigrate at a younger age and better acculturated because they grow up in Australia. So within this study, we look at Chinese immigrants who immigrated as an adult as compared with those who immigrated as a child and adolescent. What we found was that for those, sorry, the formatting is a bit off on this computer. So for those who immigrated as child and adolescent, so the better acculturated Chinese Australians have significantly higher risk for diabetes, significantly higher risk for hypertension, and more likely to have more than 3 risk factors. So a lot of them are moving away from the traditional diet that's much healthier and rich in grains and vegetables, and they tend to be heavier and having more issues with metabolic and cardiovascular health. And physical activity is an interesting one I see here. So based on years of residence, so we're seeing that if we don't look at interesting cultural contexts and gender differences, we see that there's no association between acculturation and physical inactivity, because it's pretty much the same for those who lived in Australia for less than 10 years, recent immigrants, versus those who lived here for more than 30 years. But then, when we look at by gender, we start to see this huge difference. So for females, the more acculturated Chinese Australians tend to be more active, and for males, they tend to be less active. And we also find similar findings with smokings as well. Better acculturated Chinese Australian males are less likely to smoke, and better acculturated Chinese females are more likely to smoke. So again, this is an interesting concept about the interaction between environment and behavior and culture, again, how everything come together. Because China and many East Asian countries have this similar pattern, very distinct when it comes to smoking as compared with Western countries. So in Australia, the males smoke more than females, but not by much. But in China, smoking prevalence among men has been stabilizing around 65%, and among women it's about 3% and climbing. So because culturally, smoking is very much punished among women. It's, as compared with smoking among men, is somehow encouraged socially. So when they move to a new country like Australia, where there's stricter rules and enforced policies about smoking, and the social context and social acceptability of smoking is completely different. The men, when they come here, they're more likely to cut a habit, and women, they're more likely to feel that now I'm liberated, the culture doesn't punish me to smoke anymore, I'm going to start smoking now. So this has been replicated by Korean immigrants in California, and it's basically now a well-established fact. And in fact, in China at the moment, even though the smoking rate among men has been stabilizing at a very high level, in women, there's actually a very worrying trend that it's slowly creeping up because tobacco industry start to target women by selling them freedom, by selling them women's rights, independence, the same old trick that they used for Western countries 60 years ago. They start to do that in China now. And imagine 97% of the women not smoking. That is a lot of potential. So I'm going to just go past that one. So that's another pocket of research of mine. My PhD student Kai just graduated last year, and we're now working together with the hospitalization data of New South Wales to look at how when Chinese patients, as compared with Caucasian patients, how their survival outcome is after being admitted to hospital after a major cardiovascular event. Because from her thesis, we found this very interesting phenomenon, which we named the Chinese immigrant paradox. And again, going back to the lifestyle, Chinese immigrants tend to have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly in coronary heart disease. That's what we mainly looked at. So they have a lower incidence, but judging from this meta-analysis based on 5 studies, what we found was that after they're admitted to hospitals, they actually have a worse survival outcomes in terms of rehospitalizations and mortality. So there's a lot of limitation with the existing data. We have our hypothesis, but we really want to look at exactly why could this be happening? Is there anything we could do at the practitioners level, at the systems level, to help improve their outcome after treatment? So this is a project that I actually just submitted to Cheryl, so Center for Data Health Record Linkage, and yesterday. So exciting project ongoing, and that work also funded my current Heart Foundation Future Leader Fellowship. So as you can tell, I'm a bit of an oddball. I'm doing lots of things at the same time, and I'm constantly being energized and stimulated by all these many thoughts. And fortunately that I've got so many wonderful colleagues, students, and then postdoc now that they're all helping me understand bits and pieces of the puzzles. So that's my curated platter of my research, and I hope that there will be something that you find interesting. I'm okay if not, and happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Melody. As expected, a smorgasbord of topics. I was particularly interested that you were studying about Chinese people living in Australia and then publishing in the European Journal of Cardiology. But I suppose that makes sense because you're originally from China, educated in the US, living in Australia, and have a German partner. So there's a bit of synergy there. I might just start with the first question, if that's right. You talked about sort of the interesting the causes of causes. And obviously some of those will be more influential than others, but also some of them will be more tractable or more changeable or more modifiable. So based on sort of your research and your sort of reading of the literature, what do you think are sort of some of the best bets then in terms of causes that we might actually be able to influence that would change multiple health behaviors?
That's a very good question, and I think you're asking a biased person because for me, environment is, especially the urban environment, is very close to my heart, and I think if we design an environment that is facilitating activities, and also oftentimes when we facilitate activity, we facilitate positive social interactions as well. And to me, we briefly spoke about the design of a healthy workplace earlier before, and I think if we scope that idea to the urban level, to the city level, to design better transportation system and access to healthy food, access to physical activity facilities, and access to public spaces where people can actually interact with one another. To me, that's the closest to my heart.
In some of your studies where you've got you're contrasting environmental issues like the housing where they were, the location where they're living and things like that, I would expect that you were focusing on physical activity, and it came up with a really nice explanation of that. But of course, there's all sorts of confounding factors that are hard to figure it out. But did you find a lack of difference in other outcomes? So I would imagine that the relocation or that the location would have an effect on physical activity, but maybe not on some of the other things that you're looking at, sleep and alcohol consumption and things like that. And so I would assume that it would be much stronger to show that the situation issue that you're looking at had a specific effect on the outcome most logically related to it and not on other outcomes, whereas the effect generalizes to other outcomes, then probably there's a confounding factor.
So are you suggesting a negative control? Sort of, you expect a stronger association between certain environmental attributes and physical activity, and less of an association with other behaviors, assessing them at the same time?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's a negative control model, and I'm actually, I haven't thought about that in the environmental context.
Well, it's almost like a profile analysis on the outcomes, and to show that the environmental issue that you're looking at has a significant outcome effect on things that are logically related to it, but not on other ones.
Yeah, that's it's always interesting when you present the work to a new group, and I assume is environment your field?
I'm sorry?
Is environment your main research field?
No.
See, I was just about to say, it's always interesting to present the ideas that you think are so familiar and so ingrained in your brain to someone who comes from a different perspective. And I just wanted to make sure that before I completely write you off from environmental research, because a very important concept that built environment and health researchers focus on is this conceptual match between environmental exposure and the outcome. So alcohol behaviors, it is conceptually linked to, say, exposure to alcohol outlet and advertisement in the neighborhood. Physical activity is linked to brain space. Food consumption is linked to food environment. So we always start with a preconception about conceptual match. So in a way that we kind of set ourselves up for not being able to test, like what you said, almost in a negative control sense. So I actually think that's a very cool idea. I might steal that.
So I think the most important takeaway, just to make sure I get this right, so if you don't smoke, you sleep enough, you have a healthy diet, you can drink. Everybody's wondering this, I'll just ask you. Because I mean, there was this large longitudinal study showing that any alcohol is potentially harmful, but I wonder if it's taking to interact.
It's, the questions are not perfect, and in our classification of risk, we only base on the total amount consumed in a week. So when you think about it, I don't want to glorify drinking.
I hate glorifying.
But, see, the same 14 serves per week could be completely different people. It could be someone who has 2 glasses of wine every day after a meal and just, do it in moderation, or it could be someone who drink 14 serve in one go, binge drink at a party. And this question doesn't distinguish the two. So I'm a bit reluctant to encourage drinking. And the fundamental issue with drinking is also the reference category. So as we know that, some people claim that drinking in moderation is helpful, and then I think so far the data is showing that it reduces cardiovascular disease and blah blah blah. But there's always an issue about what's the reference point, because people who don't drink at all are a combination of people who are heavy drinkers in their past life, abstinent from drinking now, but damage already done, and it could be those who absolutely just don't want to drink, and for religious reason, for health reason, whatever other lifestyle reason. So to really tease these two out is quite complicated, because usually we ask about people's behavior at this stage, we ask less about their drinking patterns in the past. So I think any drinking recommendations would be really based on comprehensively starting drinking using a life course model, how much they drunk at different stages of life.
Yeah, so I was going to say that in this research, actually, you can't answer that question, mainly because you're looking at, even if it's prospective, you're looking at one time point, and then relating that one time, whatever happened in that time point with what happened 40 years later, but you don't know what's going on.
You also, and you also don't know if somebody's already developed chronic illnesses related to drinking, therefore stopped. And so, fortunately, I'm repeating myself the 3rd time. Now we've got the updated, repeated measure linked with all-cause mortality and hospitalization now. So it's a lot of new, exciting opportunities that we can model more dynamically. So, and I can tell you the methodologies.
All right, I'm aware that we're running a little bit short of time, so I think we should all go to the pub and continue this.